Hey everybody, and welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens, and a very special welcome to this, the first episode in our 11th unit. After 6 months of dealing with elves, and I have to say, a surprising number of actual stars and swords, I think we get neither stars nor swords in the book that we are going to study over the next 6 weeks, and that, of course, comes with a star all its own, a little asterisk all its own, because we're not going to finish the reading that I set out to accomplish tonight. There is simply too much. There is simply too much prefatory, introductory material, so we're going to try and make it through 8 of the 10 chapters that I said we were going to read, but then we're also going to try and finish up the first volume of this book, which I haven't yet mentioned, Jane Austen's 1811 debut novel, Sense and Sensibility, the absolutely fantastic Sense and Sensibility. Over the course of that next 6 weeks or so, over the course of this entire unit, we're going to study the text, we're going to do the things that we do, we're going to draw out the themes, we're going to draw out the motifs, we're going to discuss the contrasts, the frictions, how this book was read then, how this book is read now, how this book will be read a generation from now, but mostly where it sits for modern readers in 2025. Glad Rebecca is joining me here live in the chat. Good to have you with me tonight, Glad Rebecca, as we begin this new unit. We've been talking about elves for so long that I'm feeling a little rusty. I sat down today to start doing the show and called up a slide that had, my little Silmarillion album art for it. And I don't think I'm going to do another 6-month series on this show, I'll tell you that much. It was so much fun, but it just gets you into a groove that then takes a lot of energy to break. Let me begin then by showing you this picture and trying to get rid of that little graphic there on the screen that indicates that I have my volume turned down. There it goes. Computers are notoriously unreliable. This, of course, is Jane Austen. This is probably the only verified picture of Jane Austen that was produced during her lifetime. This was drawn and painted. You can see the watercolor coloration there by Cassandra Austen, her eldest sister and closest friend, around 1810. Austen is born in 1775, 250 years ago, to parents George and Cassandra, both members of the minor nobility, the minor aristocracy, and both comfortably well off even before their advantageous marriage. Jane was the 7th of 8 children with 6 brothers and 1 sister. She writes from an early age. If you visit the Bodleian Library or the British Library in London, you can see 3 full notebooks labeled Volume the First, Volume the Second, Volume the Third, compiled by Austen herself from stories written between 1787 and 1794. These are her juvenile works. Let me show you. In fact, I have a picture here, the cover of Volume the First, and a page here taken from, a manuscript page here taken from the Watsons, just to show how her work is actually presented. The stories which fill the 3 volumes of Juvenilia aren't a lot like the Austen that we know now, except for, I suppose, the extraordinary, almost uncanny precision of the writing. I have not read all of them by any means, but I have dipped into them. They were also recently reprinted, in the 2010s, they were reprinted in facsimile editions with reprints of Austen's actual handwriting. If you are interested, the links to those will be in the show notes. So these stories, these juvenile stories, are generally raucous and funny and parodic, and they depict girls and young women pushing back hard against the constraints of their society to a certain extent, but much more frequently against the constraints of the kinds of stories in which heroines find themselves. Professor Catherine Sutherland wrote, quote, "The girls in these stories refuse all advice on ladylike behavior. They eat too much, they drink and gamble, get into fights. One girl steals money and then runs off with another girl's fiancé. These are stories about girls and some boys behaving badly." End quote, which is fantastic. Writing on her adaptation of the novel for the mid-90s Ang Lee movie, which we will definitely talk about in due course, the brilliant Emma Thompson described Austen's early works as being like a series of Monty Python sketches. So Austen begins working on Sense and Sensibility, well, kind of on Sense and Sensibility, in 1795. There is a common story that goes around that will tell you that the original version of Sense and Sensibility, Elinor and Marianne, was an epistolary novel, which makes sense in that epistolary novels were extremely fashionable at the time. It's a very accessible form. It really speaks to Austen's power, her command of voice and identity and character. It's very easy to think that she would slip into an epistolary format that is a collection of letters written from one character to another, right? There's only one small problem with that, which is, why would Elinor and Marianne, even in the original sketch of the story, write to each other, they are together for the entire plot, basically the entire plot. So an epistolary novel doesn't make much sense given that structure, but in all other ways, that seems very appropriate to the kind of story that Austen was undertaking. But epistolary or not, this is the story that we find ourselves with later, or at least an early draft of that story. As I say, that's 1795. That is when she is 20 years old. The following year, having set aside Elinor and Marianne, she embarks upon First Impressions, the book that will later become Pride and Prejudice. Her father... Pause. There is an idea that Austen's family is not supportive of her work. There is an idea that it's a quite hostile environment for a young female writer at the time. And generally speaking, that might be true, although there were certainly famous and lauded and well-respected female authors at the time too. But Austen was actually celebrated by her family for her talent from the time that she is 11 years old and starts writing little skits and plays and performances for the benefit of her family. They were a very literary, creative, artistic kind of family. They would get together to sing songs, and they would get together to read books aloud to one another and to generally entertain one another. And Jane, I think, was recognized from a very early age as being a special talent, as being somewhat precocious, certainly, but really quite skilled in particularly her writing. So her family is very supportive of her, including her father, who tries at this point to find a publisher for First Impressions, the first version of Pride and Prejudice, but is ultimately unsuccessful. Jane then writes Susan, which is an early form of Northanger Abbey. You can see how all of these stories are going to be recycled later in her career. That manuscript is eventually sold to a publisher for the princely sum of £10 sterling, which is about £1,500 today, about 2,000 American dollars today. So not a huge amount of money, but, you know, the first time you get paid for writing something still feels pretty special. I'm sure it did too in the early 19th century. That publisher, though, Crosby and Company, decides not to publish the book. They buy the rights and then do not print it after all. So Jane is still a distance away from being published. That is a career arc which is sadly interrupted when Jane is 30. This is the year 1805, with the death of her father, a death that is often described as being unexpected, but he was 74 years old. So rather than being completely unexpected, I think the thing that we are emphasizing here is its rapidity. He went downhill extremely quickly, and that obviously had major implications for Jane and her siblings. The next few years are complicated. She, her mother, and her sister Cassandra move around several times during these years. By 1809, though, they are in Chawton Cottage in Hampshire, which is now known, of course, as the Jane Austen Cottage. You can go there and see the museum that they have set up. All of this takes us to the brink of Austen's real literary career. It is 1811. She is 36 years old. Sense and Sensibility is published by Thomas Egerton of the Military Library Publishing House in London. However, Austen had to pay for her own publication. She could not find a publisher who was willing to take the risk on this book. So she invests more than £150, which is more than a third of her annual income, of her small, close-knit family's annual income. At that point, she invests £150 into the publication of this book. That's in order to secure the printing of 750 copies, each in 3 slim volumes. They, however, sell out by the end of the year. It is a marked success. She doubles her investment money in less than 6 months, which obviously also immediately secures a second printing. The book is famously attributed to a lady rather than Jane Austen's name, which, again, there is an idea that she was writing in secret. There's an idea that she didn't want to be identified, but as I said, there are numerous other female authors at the time who are very well known and very well regarded. It wasn't so completely controversial in the Regency period for women to write books. Celebrity wasn't seen as entirely proper, but the pursuit of writing was absolutely something that a respectable lady should engage in. So rather than seeing this as a recognition of the fact that female authors were not popular at the time or would not have been accepted at the time, instead I think we can see the choice of a woman who grew up and spent most of her life quietly in the countryside, surrounded by her family, but not exposed to the tabloid press of London, for example. That title, that attribution, by a lady will be supplanted extremely quickly, because 2 years later Pride and Prejudice is published, and it is published credited to the author of Sense and Sensibility, right? So we're already trying to build this reputation, and all of this is happening, by the way, while her brothers are going around just very loudly proclaiming that their sister wrote Sense and Sensibility. It was an absolutely open secret, particularly in the publishing industry in London, who wrote these books. It's not as though she was really keeping herself quiet there. Glad Rebecca said, did the publisher get copyright when she had to put up the full investment? No, the copyright would have remained with her. I believe that the terms of her second printing were very favorable. I think that she was then not just recompensed for her own investment, from the proceeds of selling that first print run, but that the second print run was paid for quite lavishly. She made a decent amount of money through her very short career, unfortunately. We'll get to that in just a moment. So Pride and Prejudice is published as being a novel by the author of Sense and Sensibility, but Pride and Prejudice is another thing entirely. It is such a vast, huge, immediate success that when shortly thereafter Sense and Sensibility is republished, it is published as by the author of Pride and Prejudice. So Pride and Prejudice is 1813, 2 years after Sense and Sensibility. Mansfield Park follows the following year in 1814, Emma in 1816. And on the 18th of July, 1817, at the age of 41, Jane Austen dies. In December of that year, both Persuasion and Northanger Abbey are published posthumously. Those are the first and only books which bear her name on the cover. I don't have space, obviously, to talk now about, or to speculate now, I suppose, about what kind of career Austen would have had she not died so young, so awfully, tragically young. It is, of course, tempting when a gifted artist, when a gifted creator dies early in their career. It's tempting to kind of backfill their brilliance and to speculate about the great works that they could have accomplished if only they'd had another decade or 2 or 3 or 4. But we don't have to do that with Austen. None of the tragedy of Austen's young death, none of the tragedy of her too short literary career stems from speculation about what might have been. We can look at the books that she has written and find ourselves in the company of very arguably the greatest literary mind ever. I think that there are very, very few authors who can stand close to Austen in terms of her precision, her wit, her humanity, her humility, her ability to evoke emotion on the page, and her commitment to her craft. Sense and Sensibility, as we're going to discover over the course of the next few weeks, is kind of a rough object. It is an imperfect object. It is not as refined and studied as Pride and Prejudice or as Emma. It's not quite the polished thing that we will see, but it is so much closer to that polished thing than any other writer is going to get for a century after her. It's an absolutely remarkable creative output. So when we talk about Austen's life, when we talk about the power of this first book in particular, I want to bear in mind that there is no speculation about what might have been in terms of her, or that we need not rely upon speculation about what might have been in order to appreciate her genius, her absolute on-the-page brilliance, because it is right there in front of us. And I'll say, too, that over the course of 200 years now, we have seen some of the most interesting and nuanced and progressive critical study of Austen's work that I can think of. I can't think of many authors who rival Austen in terms of their both immediate accessibility. Anyone can sit down and pick up this book and read it and get a really great story, and also their ability to yield to critical investigation and inquiry. There is some fantastic critical work out there. I will maybe try and pull some of that out as we move forward through this series. It's always challenging to try and fold in too much kind of critical reading, too much attendant reading, because I don't want to burden you guys with having to go and buy 6, textbooks that you have to go through. But there is a lot of really, really great work out there. I was just reading the Norton Library edition today, which is just genuinely just brilliant. Like, it's one of the things about Austen that I find so bewildering. And I will divorce myself from this phenomenon right now. Okay, I'm not including myself in this halo effect around Austen's work, but I find that people who write about Austen's work oftentimes do the best and most magical work of their career. Anyway, all of that. Let's, Galadra Becky's saying here that she liked Sense and Sensibility more than Pride and Prejudice. That is an unusual, but by no means a unique position, Galadra Becky. I think that Pride and Prejudice does tend to take a lot of the air out of the room as far as Austen fandom goes. I think that, I would say, I don't have numbers on this, but my lifetime in and around the Austen fandom tells me that Pride and Prejudice is absolutely at the top. Emma is a solid second place, partly because of some imaginative reinterpretations in the 1990s. And then probably Sense and Sensibility comes in third, probably around Mansfield Park, I would say. I think that maybe would be the ranking, but I'm not sure. Maybe we should do a little poll or something over on the Patreon page and figure that out. I should mention, of course, because I've alluded to it already, the fantastic 1995 Ang Lee adaptation, which, believe it or not, is the first big screen adaptation of Sense and Sensibility. Pride and Prejudice gets something like a dozen on-screen adaptations before Sense and Sensibility gets its first one, which is a TV adaptation in 1971. There is then another TV adaptation in 1981, and we get nothing for the better part of a decade and a half until Emma Thompson adapts the novel for Ang Lee and creates one of the most beloved films of the 1990s. I think that mid-period 1990 is just an extraordinary time for film in general, and that adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, the Winslet, the Hugh Grant, the Alan Rickman, the Hugh Laurie and Imogen Stubbs and Imelda Staunton, like, it is a cast that goes on for days, and every single one of those people is, I think, fantastic. We are, of course, going to be talking about that over on the Patreon page, and possibly, well, I mean, I've got a year to figure it out, I guess. Maybe I will just set a precedent that anytime there's a new adaptation of something that we've already discussed here on Stars and Swords, I will go and cover that too, because there is a new adaptation of Sense and Sensibility, which is filming right now with Daisy Edgar-Jones as Elinor and the brilliant Katrina Balfe of Outlander as Mrs. Dashwood, which is, well, that's the piece of casting that makes me excited. I'll tell you, go look at the IMDb page. I'm not sure about anyone else that's involved in this project, but we'll see how it comes together. That is, as I say, filming now, so we're expecting a late 2026 release for that one. Let's get back to our discussion here of the book. Then, like all of Austen's work, well, I suppose, like all of Austen's work, Sense and Sensibility does exist somewhat in the shadow of Pride and Prejudice, but it also has a brilliance and a precision and a cleverness that is unique to itself. Over the course of this series, I really want to mention Pride and Prejudice as little as possible and allow this book to have the effect on us, even those of us who are reading it now for the 4th or 10th or 20th times, allow this book to have the effect on us that it had on the contemporary audience in 1811, to be refreshed by it, to be struck by it anew, as it were. And we're going to be doing that by looking at the major themes and conflicts, certainly, but also looking at, as I say, the precision of the language, the way that Austen gives us these very deft portraits of these characters. And I guess I'm kind of highlighting that because I want to introduce one major interpretive lens that we're going to be relying on as we move through this reading of Sense and Sensibility, which is a product, I think, of a feminist reappraisal of this book in the mid-century, the mid-20th century. I suppose I now have to be specific about which century I'm referring to as well, because it is thought for so long. This book is positioned, right? We'll talk a little more about this when we get to Elinor and Marianne, but this book is positioned as a countertext to the rationalism of the Age of Enlightenment, in part, or at least, if not as a countertext, it is presented as a part of that ongoing discourse, right? We have the idea of the pastoral. We have the idea of this Arcadian idyll coming through the Regency period, right? This is one of the things that we associate with the Regency period is our fondness for the countryside and shepherds and building follies on cliffs and oh, isn't it all just so terribly romantic? This is kind of like the Bridgerton of it all, right? We've got this high society, yes, but we've also got all of this gentility and all of this pastoralism. The idea that we are connected to the natural world and the natural world is important, kind of striking back against that mechanistically rational process of the Age of Enlightenment. And where we situate Sense and Sensibility in terms of that swinging pendulum is going to depend on the exact moment in history in which we are reading the book. Through the Victorian era, through the 19th century, we see the critical response to Sense and Sensibility shift in a way that the critical response to Pride and Prejudice does not shift. Sense and Sensibility becomes this Schrodinger's cat of a novel. It becomes accessible to people who absolutely applaud and support Elinor's strict rationalism, right? The sense of the book. Or, alternatively, 15 years later, we're going to get people who are applauding the sensitivity with which Austen approaches the sensibility, the passion, the power, the magic, the emotion of Marianne's situation in particular, but, the world as a whole. And partly that is because it is very tempting to read this book as being a simple opposed set, right? We have two sisters, one of them is sense, one of them is sensibility. Let's look at how this odd couple gets along, shall we? And it's not that. I mean, it is that. It is like 60% that. But in each character, there is nuance. In each character, there is transformation. In each character, there is a yearning for something else. Neither of these characters, none of these characters, but particularly our two leads here, neither of these characters are as fixed as is often thought. So I want to introduce this idea right now, right up front, that there are two ways of reading even the social construct of this book, that we can applaud Elinor for being practical, for being prudent, for being judicious, for being rational, and for taking the necessary steps to secure her future in a world that will not, of its own form, on its own recognizance, take care of her, right? They are set in opposition to a patriarchal, largely misogynistic culture, right? Historically, that is true. Fictionally, diegetically, that is true. So on the one hand, we can say, yes, Elinor is doing what you have to do to survive in this kind of world. On the other hand, we can say, the world is what is wrong, and Marianne is a victim of it. And neither of those readings are complete. As we move into the text, we're going to see exactly how that comes out to us. But I want to kind of plant that idea, and I want to plant it in the context of Austen's intent. I want to consider what is being presented to us and how it is being presented so that we can better understand where the target of Austen's satirical eye has fallen. What is it exactly that she is telling us about the world in which these young characters find themselves? And boy, they are young characters. Well, we're going to get into that. In fact, let's get into that right now. I've spent a long time talking as a preamble. Let's introduce the Dashwoods, shall we? Let's get to it. The family of Dashwood had been long settled in Sussex. Their estate was large, and their residence was at Norland Park in the centre of their property, where for many generations they had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintances. The late owner, of this estate was a single man, who lived to a very advanced age, and who had for many years of his life had a constant companion and housekeeper in his sister. But her death, which happened 10 years before his own, produced a great alteration in his home. For to supply her loss, he invited and received into his house the family of his nephew, Mr. Henry Dashwood, the legal inheritor of the Norland estate, and the person to whom he intended to bequeath it. In the society of his nephew and niece and their children, the old gentleman's days were comfortably spent. His attachment to them all increased. The constant attention of Mr. and Mrs. Henry Dashwood to his wishes, which proceeded not merely from interest but from goodness of heart, gave him every degree of solid comfort which his age could receive, and the cheerfulness of the children added a relish to his existence. By a former marriage, Mr. Henry Dashwood had one son, by his present lady 3 daughters. The son, a steady, respectable young man, was amply provided for by the fortune of his mother, which had been large, and half of which devolved on him on the coming of his age. By his own marriage, likewise, which happened soon afterward, he added to his wealth. To him, therefore, the succession to the Norland estate was not so really important as to his sisters, for their fortune, independent of what might arise to them from their fathers inheriting that property, could be but small. Their mother had nothing, and their father was only £7,000 in his own disposal, for the remaining moiety of his first wife's fortune was also secured to her child, and he had only a life interest in it. A couple of quick words here. Moiety, meaning half, one remaining half, and life's interest in it, meaning that it extends no further than his life, which is to say that the access that Henry has to his ex-wife, to his deceased, his first wife's fortune, trying to take the least loaded term that I could possibly find there, that will pass. There is no possibility of inheritance there. Upon his death, that entire interest will go directly to John. It is not Henry's to bequeath to his daughters. So what do we learn from this introduction here? An introduction which, again, right, not to compare this book to Pride and Prejudice as we go, but I do think that one of the reasons that Pride and Prejudice is as successful as it is that first page, is that first line, is in effect the first chapter. We are introduced so immediately, so charmingly, so intimately to the characters of that book. in a way that we are not here. We're going to spend a long time this evening talking before we get to any attributed dialogue. We're going to spend a long time before we really get to Elinor and Marianne. But what we do get from this introduction is this idea of stability and instability. Because in the first place, we're introduced to the Dashwoods of Sussex, right? Of Norland Park, this large estate with this park right at the heart of it that has been stable, that has been well provisioned, that will continue. It is, and we get a sense of that stability, right? They had lived in so respectable a manner as to engage the general good opinion of their surrounding acquaintances. It's not just that they are financially stable, it is that they are socially stable. They are emblematic of this area, and that is a good thing. Nothing can come along to upset this. Well, except for the passing of Henry Dashwood's aunt, right, the sister of the previous holder of this estate, who then invites his nephew in to entertain him effectively through the rest of his life. And everything seems to be going well enough, right? We're getting here even the idea that Henry and Mrs. Dashwood are not just pursuing money here. This isn't just a social move for them or a financial move. It proceeded not merely from interest, right? They are, let us recognize, engaged in the future of this estate and in the future of their family's well-being, right? There is an element here of if not social climbing, then at least the leveraging of a powerful opportunity to secure your family's economic future. But they are also possessed of goodness of heart. They are also doing it because it is the right thing. And those two balances, right? The one which might be thought sense and the other which might be thought sensibility, right? The kind of the rational decision to go and stay at Norland Park with Henry's uncle and just kind of entertain him, I guess, so that they can have this secure life together. That is a rational decision. But it's also a passionate decision. It's also an emotional decision. It's also a decision that stems from something less ruthless, less mathematical, less mechanistic, and something more personal, more human. And we are going to see, here it is, right there in the first paragraph of this book, and we are going to see that manifest countless times through the course of the story. We also introduce here, let me, in fact, skip ahead, because I have prepared, at the request of my excellent and estimable partner, Elizabeth, who is having some real trouble, I have prepared a family tree here for your perusal, because we learn first of all, of course, about Henry Dashwood's first wife, who, like many of the women in this book, goes unnamed. So from the first Mrs. Dashwood, he has a son, John, who we are about to learn is married to Fanny Ferrers, who is now Fanny Dashwood, and has a son of his own, Harry, who is 6 years old, I believe, maybe 5 years old as the story actually starts. But then he remarried the second Mrs. Dashwood, from whom Henry gets 3 daughters, Elinor, Marianne, and Margaret. Mrs. Dashwood, as we begin this story, is 40, Elinor is 19, Marianne is 16, and Margaret is 13. We will dispense with Margaret very briefly in short order. It seems probable, we don't get a direct age, but it seems probable given the age of Harry, right? Harry is 5 years old. John has probably been married then for 5 years, which means that he kind of came into his majority at the age of 24, inherited what he was going to inherit, and thus married Fanny at that time. So he is probably 30 years old. That seems to be how the math works out. So Mr. Dashwood, the top left Mr. Dashwood that you can see on this slide, this is Elinor's great uncle, dies, and we're told his will gave as much disappointment as pleasure, which is one of those great standout Austen lines. Mr. Dashwood favors Harry, but is sufficiently attentive to Elinor and her sisters that he bequeaths them £1,000 each, and this worries Henry. Henry is, concerned about this because he knows how unstable and susceptible the lives of women in the world are. But he's also not that worried because, he's going to give he's going to live, a good long time, and he can definitely take care of his second wife and their daughters, only to die tragically less than a year after his uncle with only £10,000 to his name. This is our inciting incident. We are left without security for our 4 women here who form the core of our cast, Mrs. Dashwood, Elinor, Marianne, and Margaret. So John is immediately summoned back to Norland Park at that point. He's told to take care of his sisters and his mother-in-law. This is one of the reasons that I pulled this out here, because we get a specific reference, pulled the family tree here together, because we get this specific reference to John's mother-in-law, by which we do not mean Fanny's mother. We do not mean Mrs. Ferrers. We actually mean his own stepmother. The phrase mother-in-law comes into English in the 14th century, and for 600 years after that, it is any mother-in-law. The in-law suffix means anyone to whom you are legally bonded as family. So it can mean your mother-in-law, it can mean your spouse's mother, but it can also mean your own stepmother. And those two uses are completely equal, really, until the beginning of the 20th century. It is at the beginning of the 20th century that mother-in-law suddenly takes this hard turn and means the former case, right? The mother of your spouse rather than your potential stepmother, right? That is true of all of those in-law relationships. All of the stepmother, stepfather relationships, they all fall away just immediately, and it only becomes the family of your spouse that's denoted there. We can see this because we have the use of daughter-in-law in just a few pages' time to indicate Mrs. Dashwood's relationship to Fanny. Speaking of whom, let us get to our introduction to John and Fanny, whom of course we introduce before we introduce Elinor and Marianne. Here they are. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish as to be ill-disposed, but he was, in general, well-respected, for he conducted himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. Had he married a more amiable woman, he might have been made still more respectable than he was. He might even have been made amiable himself, for he was very young when he married and very fond of his wife. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of himself, more narrow-minded and selfish. When he gave his promise to his father, he meditated within himself to increase the fortunes of his sisters by the present of £1,000 apiece. He then really thought himself equal to it. The prospect of £4,000 a year, in addition to his present income, besides the remaining half of his own mother's fortune, warmed his heart and made him feel capable of generosity. Yes, he would give them £3,000. It would be liberal and handsome. It would be enough to make them completely easy. £3,000. He could spare so considerable a sum with little inconvenience. He thought of it all day long, and for many days successively, and he did not repent. Spoilers, he will ultimately repent. So we see here the idea that a young man might be presented in the pages of this book, not really in terms of his absolute qualities, but in an identification of those qualities which he lacks, right? We're getting this litotic kind of approach. He was not an ill-disposed young man, unless to be rather cold-hearted and rather selfish is to be ill-disposed. Your mileage on that may vary, right? Your personal reaction to what you think of cold-hearted and selfish might vary. But if you think that those things are bad, then yes, he probably is ill-disposed. But he is well-respected. He conducts himself with propriety in the discharge of his ordinary duties. And look, when he marries, he is young, he is susceptible, and he is very fond of his wife. He marries, at least in part, for love. We might speculate that he marries entirely for love, given his own personal income. But Mrs. John Dashwood was a strong caricature of herself, more narrow-minded and selfish. And we have to ask as we move through this, because it is going to be a recurring point, in whose POV is this passage presented? The authorial voice that Austen gives us is, well, it's really the greatest success of the Bridgerton adaptation, right? The Netflix Bridgerton show, is that in fleeting moments, hardly ever in attributed dialogue, hardly ever in the words that the characters actually say to one another, but occasionally in that narrative voice, that Lady Whistledown narrative voice, we get something close to Austen's narrative voice. We get something close to the idea of this omniscient and pointed perspective that is nonetheless kind of elusive, is nonetheless kind of deceptive. Are we really being critical of Mrs. John Dashwood at this point, or is there something else happening here? What are the suppositions that we're layering into the narrative voice? What is the ideology of the narrative voice? We'll see that more clearly when we get to the argument about how much money John is going to give to his mother and half-sisters. His stepmother, his mother-in-law, excuse me, I will use the archaic term, as perhaps I should. But here we see this moment of generosity, right? And again, we're encouraged, I think, almost to read this in two different ways. We can read it as an authentic outpouring, right? He meditated within himself to increase the fortunes of his sisters by the present of £1,000 apiece. He then really thought himself equal to it. It made him feel capable of generosity. Does he know that he can't do this? Does he know that he's going to find an excuse to not do this later? Or is he in this moment, as we get in this weird attributed dialogue here, right? This kind of what I take to be an internal monologue for our boy John here. Yes, he would give them £3,000. It would be liberal and handsome. It would be enough to make them completely easy. £3,000. He could spare so considerable sum with little inconvenience, right? All of which seems to be true. And yet, as we are going to see, that's going to pivot away. So what is being established here? Are we being led to an understanding of this character that is sincere or that is satirical, that is parodic? Let's finally then get to the introduction to the heart of our novel, to Elinor and Marianne. Elinor, this eldest daughter whose advice was so effectual, possessed a strength of understanding and coolness of judgment which qualified her, though only 19, to be the counsellor of her mother and enabled her frequently to counteract, to the advantage of them all, the eagerness of mind in Mrs. Dashwood, which must generally have led to imprudence. She had an excellent heart. Her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong, but she knew how to govern them. It was a knowledge which her mother had yet to learn, and which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. Marianne's abilities were in many respects quite equal to Elinor's. She was sensible and clever, but eager in everything. Her sorrows, her joys could have no moderation. She was generous, amiable, interesting. She was everything but prudent. The resemblance between her and her mother was strikingly great. Elinor saw with concern the excess of her sister's sensibility, but by Mrs. Dashwood it was valued and cherished. They encouraged each other now in the violence of their affliction. The agony of grief which overpowered them at first was voluntarily renewed, was sought for, was created again and again. They gave themselves up wholly to their sorrow, seeking increase of wretchedness in every reflection that could afford it, and resolved against ever admitting consolation in future. Elinor, too, was deeply afflicted, but still she could struggle, she could exert herself, she could consult with her brother, could receive her sister-in-law on her arrival and treat her with proper attention, and could strive to rouse her mother to similar exertion and encourage her to similar forbearance. So Sense and Sensibility. As I said, it is tempting because of the construction of the novel, because of the construction of the title, to put a little label on Elinor that says sense and a little label on Marianne that says sensibility, which I should maybe clarify here that to the 19th century reader, the idea of sensibility would have been very contemporary, right? The idea of emotional consciousness only arrives in the middle of the 17th century. So it's only, 50 years it's been in the popular imagination at that point. This is the ability to feel deeply and truly, to experience in the body as well as the mind. Sense here, rationality, right? Dry and mental. Sensibility, emotionalism here, lush and physical. And this is, as I said, because we're situating this story at the end of that pendulum swing coming out of the Age of Enlightenment, right? Coming out of Enlightenment philosophy. And we're going to see, as we move through the 2 centuries since the publication of this book, that pendulum, as I say, swing back and forth. But even here on the page, in our first introduction, it is evident that it is not the case that Elinor is all mind and Marianne all heart. We're told of Elinor, she had an excellent heart, her disposition was affectionate, and her feelings were strong. What is the difference? She can rein them in. She can exercise a kind of self-control. That is the specific difference. That is how we differentiate between Elinor and Marianne. It is not that one is inherently more deeply feeling or that one is more inherently cool and calculating. We're told when we introduce Marianne, right? Her abilities are in many respects quite equal to Elinor. She's sensible and clever, but eager in everything. That's how we reach that point of differentiation, that Elinor can control herself. And it's not just that Marianne doesn't. It's not just that she can't, it's that she absolutely chooses not to, right? Which one of her sisters had resolved never to be taught. She does not even want to learn how to tighten her hold on her emotions. Because, by implication, she believes them to be admirable. She believes them to be positive. She believes them to be part of the experience of life. It's not, I don't take Marianne's, refusal to be coldly rational to be an act of imprudent rebellion. It's more, as we see reflected in Mrs. Dashwood here, it's more an approach to life itself, right? Gladderecki's observing in the chat here that John is basking a bit in his virtue in the moment of generosity. I think that is absolutely correct. I think you're completely right there. And I do take, sometimes as I'm presenting these questions, I wind up, leaving myself a little isolated as to my own opinions. I do take that to be satire. I do take that he thought himself capable of generosity is him believing in that moment, kind of puffing himself up to believe that he is capable of this kind of largesse, of this kind of support, right? That it would be handsome, that it would be good, that it would actually be like a really strong move. Even in that moment, knowing that he's not going to follow through with it, that he's going to look for and definitely find a means by which he can excuse his refusal or his decision not to give that money to his family. But that alone gives us a really interesting perspective on Fanny, because when we get to that discussion, the narrative voice, I think, is going to lean on the idea that it is Fanny talking John down from his initial pledge of generosity and largesse, right? That he is going to be the providential elder brother here, that he's going to take care of his family properly, and that Fanny is the one that is arguing against that. But we're going to look at some of that as we get to it. Let's see here as we move forward. Oh, I should, just observe there as we're introducing Elinor and Marianne, and I just cut the slide off early because I could have fit it on the page, but we don't really need to, because one of the things for which Austen ought to be celebrated is completely jumping the gun on the Hamilton joke and Peggy, because 200 years before Lin-Manuel Miranda wrote that musical, she gave us Margaret. And Margaret's adorable, but Margaret is... And, we're coming to this. If you are reading this after you have read Pride and Prejudice, as I think many modern readers are, then you're familiar with the idea that sometimes Austen just has too many sisters. She just includes too many sisters for the narrative to really encompass. There's no real reason that Margaret shouldn't have a plotline, but there's also no real reason that Margaret should exist at all in this book. One of the great advantages of having a searchable digital copy of this book on my computer here is that I can do exactly that. I can count the number of instances of any given word, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that Elinor is named around 700 times in this book. Marianne is named around 600 times in this book, and Margaret gets 36 mentions in the entire book. So... I'm not sorry that I didn't call her out there. I'm not sorry that I didn't pull a slide for the benefit of our introduction to Margaret. Let's get into chapter 2, as I'm already halfway through tonight's session. We move from the gloss of history that we get in that opening chapter, right? We kind of catch up to what we take to be a new and sustainable status quo, at least for a short period of time. Fanny has taken over Norland Park. Mrs. Dashwood and her daughter are being treated civilly, if somewhat like visitors in their own home. And then throughout the rest of this chapter, let's take a look at the slide that I have here. Throughout the rest of this chapter, we get this extended, brilliant scene between Fanny and John. This is such fantastic character writing. You are left in absolutely no doubt, I think, who these people are and the way in which they reinforce each other's worst judgments and worst biases too, I think, right? We come all the way through as step by step by step, we cut the amount of money that John is going to give to his stepmother and his half-sisters. And as I said, it's easy to read the interaction between the two as Fanny taking control of her husband. But if we're reading that previous passage carefully, I think we might see something that is more mutual here, right? This is not to let Fanny off the hook, although I will have a word to say about that in just a moment. First, though, this slide. Perhaps then it would be better for all parties if the sum were diminished one half. £500 would be a prodigious increase to their fortunes. Oh, beyond anything great! What brother on earth could do half so much for his sisters, even if really his sisters, and as it is, only half-blood? But you have such a generous spirit. I would not wish to do anything mean, he replied. One had rather, on occasion, do too much than too little. No one, at least, can think I have not done enough for them. Even themselves, they can hardly expect more. There is no knowing what they may expect, said the lady. But we are not to think of their expectations. The question is what you can afford to do. Certainly, and I think I may afford to give them £500 apiece. As it is, without any addition of mine, they will each have above £3,000 on their mother's death, a very comfortable fortune for any young woman. Quick point of clarification there. Mean has shifted in its meaning, particularly here in the United States. John's assertion there in the third paragraph, I would not wish to do anything mean. He means stingy, right? He means penny pinching. He means he would not like to be tight-fisted. He would not like to withhold money just for the sake of withholding money. Mean in this context and at that time had no connotation of cruelty. right, in that moment. Although, obviously, we can see the modern applicability of that, too. So it's difficult to read exactly how we understand this, right? Okay, so first of all, we have established very thoroughly the importance of money, the importance of a comfortable income, the importance of social stability and stability within one's society, right? And also the importance of social expectations. When we're introduced to the Dashwoods, we're told that they are well respected. One of the things that John is immediately thinking of here is how this act will be perceived. No one, at least, can think I have not done enough for them. Even themselves, they can hardly expect more, right? And as his wife points out, well, let's not worry what they think. Let's not worry what they expect. We're going to have some words to say about expectations and where they come from later in this week's reading. But he is mindful of how the thing looks. Even when he's thinking about giving them the full amount, he's mindful of how things look. It will be handsome. It will be generous, right? He's going to be well regarded in society for his generosity at that point. But here we're even now, even at the beginning of this entire passage, we're kind of breaking it down. And we have openly described, within the narrative voice itself, we have openly presented Fanny as a caricature of her husband, of a distilled form. But also here we're seeing these aspects of, well, we might speculate, someone who is selfish, someone who is predatory, someone who is self-regarding, someone who has little empathy for people, particularly people who are not of her immediate family, right? This distinction here, that it would be what brother on earth would do half as much for his sisters, even if really his sisters, and as it is, only half blood. Like, wow, you owe these people nothing, and you're being so generous by cutting your offer in half already. But we're having this discussion because we're in the midst of a story that is predicated on the idea that a moment of bad fortune, a moment of bad luck, can strip away a woman's security without any warning or any right of appeal. The fact that Mrs. Dashwood's husband dies suddenly, a year after his uncle dies, has endangered that entire part of the family, has rendered that part of the family insecure. And maybe that positioning, that narrative positioning within the book, encourages us to look a little at what Fanny is arguing here, that you ought not to give up this much money, particularly when we get to the argument about an annuity, right? She tries to argue him down from giving them a sum of money every year because you don't know what the future holds. And perhaps she is thinking about her own security, her own stability, her own future. It's a speculative point, but I think that the book is already encouraging us, even as we are presented with, a fairly comprehensively bad dude, or at least an imperfectly good dude in the form of John, and then his caricature of a wife, right? Avowedly a caricature. I think that the book is already encouraging us to see more here than is just presented on the page. So from here, we continue the negotiation. They negotiate themselves down and down and down through the lump sum payments, down to the annuity, to occasional gifts, which is perhaps the most insulting thing of all, right? From time to time, I can pass them £50 when I feel like it, which is just so egregious. All the way down to a kind of bare minimum kindness, the quote that we get at the end here. The argument was irresistible. It gave to his intentions whatever of decision was wanting before, and he finally resolved that it would be absolutely unnecessary, if not highly indecorous, to do more for the widow and children of his father than such kind of neighborly acts as his own wife pointed out. Not just that he doesn't have to do it, but in fact, it would kind of be gauche to do it. It would kind of be gross to extend them too much kindness, to elevate their position above that which it should naturally be. 6 months pass, and we drop into chapter 3 in Mrs. Dashwood's POV as she considers her relationship at that point with her stepson and her daughter-in-law, and an introduction of a possible romance. But this is where we introduce Edward, the brother of Fanny. Mrs. Dashwood supports the match because Elinor likes him. We note again, right, in this absence of quality, that he is not handsome, not charming, not talented, but that he's not those things, and that careful scrutiny might be rewarding. Let's take a look at the next slide. Edward had been staying several weeks in the house before he engaged much of Mrs. Dashwood's attention, for she was at that time in such affliction as rendered her careless of surrounding objects. She saw only that he was quiet and unobtrusive, and she liked him for it. He did not disturb the wretchedness of her mind by ill-timed conversation. She was first called to observe and approve him farther by a reflection which Elinor chanced one day to make on the difference between him and his sister. It was a contrast which recommended him most forcibly, to her mother. "It is enough," said she. To say that he is unlike Fanny is enough. It implies everything amiable. I love him already." I think you will like him, said Elinor, when you know more of him. Like him, replied her mother with a smile. I can feel no sentiment of approbation inferior to love. You may esteem him. I have never yet known what it was to separate esteem and love. Really leaning into that idea that everything that Mrs. Dashwood feels is at an 11. The idea here, I don't know when is the best time to talk about this, honestly. I don't know when exactly. I guess we should hold it. Let's keep it back, because I did pull the conversation. Yes, I pulled the conversation between Elinor and Marianne, so we'll get to that in just a moment. We'll talk a little more about Edward and what it is to appreciate Edward. But here we can see already Mrs. Dashwood wanting not to be shaken out of her bad mood, right? Wanting not to be shaken out of her wretchedness. We already saw that in the aftermath of her husband's death. Her and Marianne kind of reinforcing each other's grief, wallowing in their grief, feeling the enormity, the power of these incredible emotions, and vowing never to be pulled voluntarily from them. There's no interest in moving past it. There's no interest in reining in these powerful feelings, but rather indulging them at every opportunity. And here we see exactly the same thing. Having been a guest in her own home now these last 6 months, she's feeling wretched. She's feeling this enmity with Fanny throughout. And of course, it is that cracks her out of this self-regard for just a moment, as Elinor chanced one day to make an observation on the difference between Edward and his sister, a contrast which recommended him most forcibly to her mother. Everything that Fanny is not must therefore be good, so Mrs. Dashwood loves him, because good things ought to be loved, because there is no moderation, there's no middle space on the dial of her emotional feeling. I can feel no sentiment of approbation inferior to love. I have never yet known what it was to separate esteem and love. There is only the fullest, most wholehearted, whole-bodied expression of appropriate and positive feeling. Let's get to the interaction here, the very brief interaction that I've pulled here between Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood. This is when Marianne is complaining that, in fact, Edward is just a cold fish, that he is lacking in passion, he is lacking in animation, he is lacking in some kind of performative depth and skill here. She's complaining about his inability to read powerfully the night before, and lamenting that Elinor can be attracted to him even though he is so lacking in all of these obvious ways. And Mrs. Dashwood observes that if she'd been if she'd been so unimpressed with his reading, she might have passed him the works of Cooper. Nay, mamma, if he is not to be animated by Cooper, but we must allow for difference of taste. Elinor has not my feelings, and therefore she may overlook it and be happy with him. But it would have broken my heart had I loved him to hear him read with so little sensibility. Mamma, the more I know of the world, the more I am convinced that I shall never see a man whom I can really love. I require so much. He must have all Edward's virtues, and his person and manners must ornament his goodness with every possible charm. Remember, my love, that you are not 17. It is yet too early in life to despair of such a happiness. Why should you be less fortunate than your mother? In one circumstance only, my Marianne, may your destiny be different from hers. Which is, at least, a genuinely lovely and affectionate and warm place to end. We know that Mrs. Dashwood comes into her marriage with nothing, right? We know that she is financially and socially disadvantaged when she makes the match with her husband, but the love which they feel for one another is evident right there, right? You're not even 17. You don't give up on men yet. You're going to find someone that's going to be a good match for you. Why would you be less fortunate than I was knowing your father? In one circumstance only, my Marianne, may your destiny be different from hers. In that one way, I hope that your future love is not taken from you as early and as cruelly as mine was. Really, I kind of pulled this because I wanted the opportunity to talk about Cooper, William Cooper. I know, C-O-W-P-E-R. Cooper is how we pronounce that, regardless of what your audiobook version of Sense and Sensibility will tell you. William Cooper was born in 1731, and he's included here because he was a particular favorite of Austen in real life. And he is the perfect artistic hero for Marianne because Cooper's work was some pretty wild stuff. Honestly, he begins writing very effusive and passionate love poetry to his cousin Theodora. He becomes an evangelical Calvinist, a really staunch, fiery evangelical Calvinist after a failed suicide attempt, But then years later, he suffers from what contemporary accounts describe as an attack of insanity, quote, very much, unquote, after which he believes that despite his evangelical Calvinism, he has been damned by God, that he is going to hell no matter what. So he starts writing this series of hymns and passionate kind of Calvinist apologetics, and also a number of other pieces. He writes he begins his mature writing career, in fact, with this lengthy, passionate condemnation of polygamy, which no one was talking about, which was not legal in England at the time, and never has been, and seems to be a really weird place to kind of plant your flag for no good reason. He just kind of took against all the polygamists out there and wrote a very strange polemic. In addition to many other great accomplishments in his writing career, he coins the phrase "God moves in mysterious ways." That's in a hymn that he wrote. He refuses to commit to any of the women with whom he has long and ongoing and oftentimes domestic partnerships, but all of which seem to have been maintained in this very carefully asexual tone. It isn't at all clear that he had any kind of sexual relationships with those women simultaneous to that, but also weirdly distinct from that. There are ongoing but not particularly scandalous accusations or impressions of homosexuality, which doesn't seem to in any way tarnish his reputation, as you might expect for someone living in that time. I read I will have to dig this up for the show notes, but I read a great paper from a writer named Konrad Brunstrom entitled "Leaving the Herd, How Queer Was Cooper," which suggests that Brunstrom probably thinks that it's pronounced Cowper as well because of the herd pun. I'm not sure for sure, but yeah. Near the end, it offers this fantastic summation. I wanted to quote just one line from that paper. Quote, "Studying Cooper's sex life is an experience akin to reading a chapter from Sterne, offering a rambling, slightly rude joke with no punchline." The Sterne there being Lawrence Sterne, the author of Tristram Shandy. Austen's favorite piece of work by Cooper was this immense poem, this 6,000-line poem called The Task, split across 6 parts, each of which is distinct but also runs into the other parts too in some weird ways. I think I pulled a slide from this. Yes, I pulled a brief slide just to give you a sense of what it is that Marianne is passionate about and really where we are positioning creative sensibility in Austen's schematic at this time, right? This is the kind of thing that she's thinking of. This is, as I say, a piece that Austen could quote chapter and verse. So this is from lines 117 to 127 from Book 5, The Winter Morning's Walk, from Cowper's The Task, published in 1785. "Here grotto within grotto safe defies the sunbeam. There embossed and fretted wild, the growing wonder takes 1,000 shapes capricious, in which fancy seeks in vain the likeness of some object seen before. Thus nature works as if to mock at art, and in defiance of her rival powers, by these fortuitous and random strokes, performing such inimitable feats as she with all her rules can never reach, less worthy of applause, though more admired." So we see here some of that idea of the artistry, the beauty, the power found in nature, this kind of anti-rationalist flight to the countryside, flight to the hills and dales of England's green and pleasant land, but also the passion, right? This is the talk of sex and of lovers and of immediate kind of desires here, kind of permeated all through our approach to our interactions with, our relationships with the natural world. This is the kind of thing that Marianne is obviously very passionate about, and I think that attributing to Marianne a love of Cooper is of Cooper, excuse me. See, I fell into it right there. Attributing to Marianne a love of Cooper is a very deft piece of characterization per Austen there. So, in any case, here, let me pull down that slide. We have now established our heroes. We're pages and pages into the book, but we have finally got to our heroines, and we've established Edward, albeit in absence. Again, to commend Austen, the idea that Edward should make such a small impression that we ourselves are not really introduced to him except by the direct account of others, which is kind of how Mrs. Dashwood has introduced him in the first place, I think is really, really great. We get the conversation between Elinor and Marianne here about Edward, which is really kind of a conversation about taste, right? As Marianne says, quote, "that rapturous delight which in her opinion could alone be called taste." again, kind of positioning the two of them on opposite sides of an emotional divide, of an artistic divide, right? The idea that taste should be not discriminatory, but celebratory, that it should not involve an intellectual assessment of the qualities of a given piece of art, but can be measured only in the intensity of the emotional response that art engenders, right? Very much in line with Marianne's love of Cooper from the previous chapter. And this is fascinating, of course, because, I mean, here I am doing a piece of intellectual analysis of this piece of art. I'm in a very vulnerable position here vis-a-vis intellectual delight versus kind of emotional movement. But I think that Austen is highlighting a question that is genuinely relevant to her culture at the time, as it is genuinely relevant to our culture today. And I think that in the spirit of Austen, that question can best be encapsulated by the timeless, almost Socratic question, is Materialists a better movie than Sharknado? And I'm referencing Materialists there partly because I saw it this week. And also partly because, of course, Celine Song is drawing heavily on Austen in the creation of this weird kind of not really a love triangle, not really a romantic comedy kind of film. I recommend Materialists. It's not very good, but it is very interesting. It's not as good as Past Lives, Celine Song's prior film, but it is very, very interesting, I think, and a really sharply observed piece. But the idea here, right, is art is taste supposed to stem from education and an intellectual appreciation of what is happening in the medium in front of you? Or is it about your raw enjoyment, your raw engagement? Is a crossword puzzle objectively better than a roller coaster, right? We can kind of hold those two ideas as like the pinnacle of the intellectual and the pinnacle of the physical. We can hold those across from each other, and we can meaningfully debate which is better. Though, of course, inevitably, even a sophomoric attempt at that discussion is going to lead you to the point where, well, you kind of need both, right? Which is what we're doing throughout this book. It's so interesting to look at Sense and Sensibility as a title, as it's introduced to us, as by implication, this duality, this combined pair of opposites, this antithetical pairing. But of course, it's not, and we're going to continue to see that as we move forward. I'm mindful again now of the time. So all of this is to say that Elinor, in her sense, projects this kind of theoretical, abstracted kind of praise, right? Edward doesn't draw, but if he did, he would probably draw well. He doesn't have good faith in his own judgment, which one might argue by implication would make his judgment inherently bad, right? Just the lack of certainty about one's taste kind of means that your taste is at least uncertain, if not outright bad. But if he did have more confidence, then he would have good taste. These are cool, considered discriminatory judgments, right? She is looking at Edward and drawing these inferences, and it is with the inferences that she is, by implication, falling in love. That is antithetical to Marianne's approach of immediate, thunder and lightning out of a clear blue sky, right? She has to be rocked back on her heels in order to appreciate the moment. We are here introducing Edward, yes, but we are also, by extension, introducing Willoughby, or at least the spectre, the shape, the outline of a Willoughby. The lovely Leslie Skipa over in the Next Word Discord was commenting today that Elinor here is kind of echoing Catherine de Bourgh in Pride and Prejudice when she's talking about her daughter and how she doesn't play piano, but if she did, she would play beautifully. We're kind of doing the same thing here. Austen kind of has this... we're going to do that again, in fact, when we get to Marianne's pianoforte, which I think is actually going to be in next week's reading. I don't remember exactly where I drew the line between this week and next week, but when we get to Marianne playing pianoforte, that might in fact be the last scene of tonight's reading. Let's see if we can get to that, because we kind of replicate that same idea there, which is fascinating because we are... For all that it is fair to say, I think that Austen's books do have their own unique charms and values, that they are distinct and possessed of a unique voice, each one of them. There are these recurring beats that we see, these satirical beats coming through, like this notion, this kind of nominal joke of, well, you would be that if you were, but since you're not, is something that we see again and again from her. Let's get to the discussion now between Elinor and Marianne about Edward himself. I shall very soon think him handsome, Elinor, if I do not now. When you tell me to love him as a brother, I shall no more see imperfection in his face than I do now in his heart. Elinor started at this declaration and was sorry for the warmth she had been betrayed into in speaking of him. She felt that Edward stood very high in her opinion. She believed the regard to be mutual, but she required greater certainty of it to make Marianne's conviction of their attachment agreeable to her. She knew that what Marianne and her mother conjectured one moment, they believed the next. That with them, to wish was to hope, and to hope was to expect. She tried to explain the real state of the case to her sister. "I do not attempt to deny," said she, "that I think very highly of him, that I greatly esteem, that I like him." Marianne here burst forth with indignation. "Esteem him? Like him? Cold-hearted, Elinor! Oh, worse than cold-hearted, ashamed of being otherwise! Use those words again, and I will leave the room this instant." This is the moment where, despite the previous conversation, wherein the reader might have inferred, as Mrs. Dashwood and Marianne have both inferred, that Elinor and Edward are on the precipice of betrothal, if not already secretly engaged, right? That's absolutely where they see this relationship going. It's where Marianne sees this relationship going. When you tell me to love him as a brother, right? The moment that you reveal to me that you all are getting hitched, I am right there with you. I will sign up. I will think him just as handsome as you. I already think he's a decent dude, but you know, as soon as that news reaches my ears, I will be converted and convinced as to his handsomeness. But Elinor has not had that experience. She doesn't live in the same kind of emotional tenor as her sister and her mother do. So she pauses here, right? She believes the regard to be mutual, but she requires greater certainty of it to make Marianne's conviction of their attachment agreeable to her. She's not going to talk about Edward in that way until she has more proof that he responds to her the way that she feels about him, or that their attraction and attachment are mutual, or even perhaps we might infer that she really does feel the way about him that she thinks that she does, or thinks that she might. So she backpedals, right? "I do not attempt to deny that I think very highly of him, that I greatly esteem, that I like him," kind of echoing that conversation with Mrs. Dashwood earlier. And Marianne has had enough. Like him, esteem him, cold-hearted Elinor, oh, worse than cold-hearted. It's not just that you are this rational, sister robot. It's that you are ashamed of having these great feelings, that you aren't just saying that you don't possess them, that you are proclaiming them to be bad, that this enormity of feeling, this magnitude of what? Affection, love, desire, like emotional presence and intensity. And all of this, of course, pivots around this idea, this core idea that we're going to repeat again and again as we move through the book in myriad different ways, right? This is a very subtle but absolutely recurring and constant theme of the book, thus the title of tonight's session here. She knew that what Marianne and her mother conjectured one moment, they believed the next. That with them, to wish was to hope, and to hope was to expect. This chain of imagination into expectation, and by implication, right, into the possibility of disappointment. Like, that is why expectations are a bad thing, because they might be thwarted, they might be denied. You might not get something that you don't just want, but you feel you have a right to. Consider when we get to the cottage and Mrs. Dashwood is kind of, she's settling in and she's kind of running ahead in her thoughts and thinking, well, this place isn't great, but it's too late in the year to do everything now. And when we get to the spring, if I have any money, which of course I super will, then we can make all of these changes, right? She is there idly fantasizing. She's ideating in that moment, right? To wish was to hope. Oh, I wonder if this could happen. Wouldn't it be great if this could be? Wow, I really hope that it will be. Wow, it should be. I deserve this now. And this is a road to emotional instability. Emotional instability, population U, right? This is not a way of maintaining a careful and prudent, I'm going to keep coming back to this word because it really is the best and most precise means, I think, of isolating exactly the point of difference between Elinor and Marianne, because it's not about passion and it's not about want and it's not about desire. It is about prudence, that Elinor is prudent and that Marianne is decidedly and avowedly and rebelliously imprudent. So we see that Elinor isn't terribly, in fact, close to getting engaged to Edward, or doesn't feel that she is, at least. And even in this moment, which I really love, even in the aftermath of that brief exchange, we get this great silver lining that Marianne gets and says, well, okay, it sucks that you're not as close to betrothal as your mom and I thought that you were. But the good news is that means we're not going to be separated, and it gives Edward time to learn to draw, which is at least a very generous position. We learn that Edward's financial position, is at least a little less certain than we might have assumed due to his mother. This is articulated by Fanny, and Mrs. Dashwood decides that she is done with the whole thing. She's done that. She's taken all that she can take, and she can't take no more. So she is going to leave Norland, and this is when felicitously a letter arrives from Sir John Middleton inviting them to Barton Cottage in Devonshire. At least we're in Sussex now. Devonshire's in the southwestern corner of England, so we're at least 100, probably 120, 140 miles west of Norland Park. We then move into chapter 5 with Mrs. Dashwood telling her son and daughter-in-law. We get this great scene where she reveals that she is leaving. John does the like obligatory, "Oh, well, I sure hope you're not moving too far." And she's like, "I'm moving to Devon." Again, 120, 140, 150 miles is a lot in England by any measure. Even today, like, that's still quite far in England. But certainly at the time, that's a very significant distance indeed. She does the thing of returning the social obligation and inviting them to visit, and then turning to Edward and much more warmly and intentionally and authentically inviting him to visit too. The narrative voice even calls out that she is doing that in part to spite Fanny and to continue to demonstrate her support for the relationship between Elinor and Edward, despite what Fanny's mother might think. Preparations are made. The servants are dispatched to Devonshire. We conclude the brief chapter with the inevitable understanding, coming to the realization that John will not, of course, in fact, hand over any money at all. I think we'd already kind of jumped to that inevitable conclusion, but here we are nonetheless. And then we get that brilliant extended piece as Marianne is like walking around Norland in all of her passion, feeling all of her feelings so powerfully, saying that though it will not miss them, though their absence will not change this place one bit, that no one will be there to love it as she does, as they do. And it's easy, I think, to see that as just a little comic skit right there at the end of the chapter, just to give Marianne this opportunity to use a lot of em dashes and exclamation points. I am in no place to talk about the use of em dashes and semicolons. During my research today, I found that there are people out there who do not like Jane Austen's constant use of semicolons. I find it a very modest number, honestly. I find it like a really average kind of number of semicolons in her text, which probably says more about me than it does about Austen. But rather than simply being this comic moment of Marianne kind of using all of the punctuation on the modern keyboard, it really is true, I think, that she is feeling not just the depth of separation, but also this connection to art and beauty, that it ought to be recognized, that it ought to be praised, that it ought to be experienced, that there is a pact between artist and audience, art and audience, right? That something ought to be appreciated, and if it's not, then something is tangibly lost, even if it doesn't have a physical consequence. Let's move into chapter 6 here, and as I say, this study of Barton College as we arrive in our new home. As a house, Barton Cottage, though small, was comfortable and compact. But as a cottage, it was defective, for the building was regular, the roof was tiled, the window shutters were not painted green, nor were the walls covered with honeysuckles. A narrow passage led directly through the house into the garden beyond. On each side of the entrance was a sitting room about 16 feet square, and beyond them were the offices and the stairs. 4 bedrooms and 2 garrets formed the rest of the house. It had not been built many years and was in good repair. In comparison of Norland, it was poor and small indeed, but the tears which recollection called forth as they entered the house were soon dried away. They were cheered by the joy of the servants on their arrival, and each for the sake of the others resolved to appear happy. It was very early in September. The season was fine, and from first seeing the place under the advantage of good weather, they received an impression in its favour, which was of material service in recommending it to their lasting approbation. The joke here at the beginning that it fails as a cottage because it was regular and the roof was tiled and the window shutters were not painted green. This is because the word cottage, right? Kind of indicating this rustic, picturesque, adorable, rural quality, right? This is relatively new to Austen's time. This only comes into use in the middle to late middle of the 17th century. So it's only really been in popular use for about 50 years. Prior to that, for hundreds of years, the word cottage would indicate like really slummy, low-class housing, right? Really real working-class homes. So we're conjuring this idea, as I said, about this pastoralism, this ruralism that's been so fashionable of late in Austen's time. That's one of the ways in which we reposition the cottage as this idyllic countryside retreat. But if it's going to be an idyllic countryside retreat, it doesn't need to be a relatively new build that is all properly rectilinear and properly tiled here rather than thatched, of course, without, decorous window shutters and without honeysuckles covering the walls, as we might in their situation. It feels as though the Dashwoods were maybe expecting more of a hobbit hole. They were maybe expecting more of a Bag End here. And instead what they get is a nice, modest, fairly modern home. The offices here I wanted to call out too. On each side of the entrance was a sitting room about 16 feet square, and beyond them were offices and the stairs. The offices here are not, offices, but they are places of work. They are the kitchens and the pantries, or probably singular of all of those, in fact, but the kitchen and the pantry and possibly a laundry too. In comparison of Norland, it was poor and small indeed, but the tears which recollection called forth as they entered the house were soon dried away, right? We get this wild emotional swing, presumably from Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood more than from Elinor herself, where we are weeping for the memory of Norland as we come into this small home that nonetheless is so charming and is so beautiful. The weather is so good, right? The season is fine. From first seeing the place under the advantage of good weather, they received an impression in its favor, which was of material service in recommending it to their lasting approbation. So their first impression of it, as we know from the moment that they come down into the valley, their first impression of it is so positive that they kind of resettle themselves and kind of reconcile themselves to the idea of this being their new home. And I do want to focus too, because, again, from a modern perspective, and presumably from a contemporary perspective too, though contemporary perspectives with this kind of detail are few and far between, from a modern perspective, it's real easy to see Elinor kind of, carrying the bags and taking care of everything and making sure that everything is where it should be, making sure that she has the keys and that the servants are all happy and that they have everything that they need, and all of the, these incremental logistics of moving into a new home, while Marianne and Mrs. Dashwood are, I don't know, either weeping inconsolably or running around like the girls at the beginning of My Neighbor Totoro, just like dashing hither and yon all around this house. But they all themselves resolve to appear happy, each for the sake of the others, resolve to appear happy. They're all having complicated feelings, Elinor included. They're all having complicated feelings about moving to this cottage, but they all decide to put on a brave face and make the best of it for the benefit of the others. They are a really functional and kind of beautiful family unit here. Let me see how I'm doing. Yeah, I've only got one more slide to go tonight, so let's get into our final slide in just a moment. We get as I said previously, that extended monologue from Mrs. Dashwood about the improvements to the house, right, which stray immediately, even taking into account that, wish to hope to expectation, slippery slope that we mentioned earlier, we almost immediately stray beyond the plausible and then stray beyond the possible. We get into some, by the time we're getting to adding rooms and widening the staircase and so on, like really changing the material fabric of the house is not an easy thing to undertake. And where does she suppose that they would live while such work was taking place? We're really not getting into the detail of it, but it is exactly that replication of what Elinor described earlier. The wish turns to the hope, turns to the expectation, and thus to acknowledge, to permit the possibility of disappointment. We then get the introduction to Sir John Middleton, all, good manners and generosity and sending the newspaper down every day. And then we get the introduction to his lady wife. They were, of course, very anxious to see a person on whom so much of their comfort at Barton must depend, and the elegance of her appearance was favourable to their wishes. Lady Middleton was not more than 6 or 7 and 20. Her face was handsome, her figure tall and striking, and her address graceful. Her manners had all the elegance which her husband's wanted. But they would have been improved by some share of his frankness and warmth, and her visit was long enough to detract something from their first admiration by showing that, though perfectly well-bred, she was reserved, cold, and had nothing to say for herself beyond the most commonplace inquiry or remark. Conversation, however, was not wanted, for Sir John was very chatty, and Lady Middleton had taken the wise precaution of bringing with her their eldest child, a fine little boy about 6 years old, by which means there was one subject always to be recurred to by the ladies in case of extremity, for they had to inquire his name and age, admire his beauty, and ask him questions which his mother answered for him, while he hung about her and held down his head, to the great surprise of her ladyship, who wondered at his being so shy before company when he could make noise enough at home. On every formal visit, a child ought to be of the party, by way of provision for discourse. In the present case, it took up 10 minutes to determine whether the boy was most like his father or mother, and in what particular he resembled either, for of course everybody differed, and everybody was astonished at the opinion of the others. And if anyone ever asks you whether or not Jane Austen has anything to say to readers in 2025, whether or not there's any applicability to the modern world, surely we have advanced so far in the last 2 centuries of existence that the social mores, the small talk and nicety of Jane Austen's world surely has nothing to say to the modern audience. I would like you to point them to this paragraph. This paragraph in which the provision of a small boy lubricates social discourse for the entire afternoon. It's so brilliantly well observed. It is so brilliantly recognizable. It is so completely true, I think, to human existence, whether you are talking about 1811 or 2025 or every single year between the two and long into the future too. I particularly love that he held down his head to the great surprise of her ladyship, who wondered at his being so shy before company, as he could make noise enough at home. We have all, I am certain, had or been close to that exact experience. So here we're introducing an age gap relationship, which might be significant in the very near future. Sir John is 40 years old. His wife, 26 or 27, so that is an age gap of 13 or 14 years. By virtue of the fact that their eldest child is 6, doing the same kind of math that we did with John and Fanny's kid, then we might speculate that she was in her early 20s by the time that they married. And I will note here, because it allows us to reflect on what contemporary audiences might have made of Austen's character, right? I have done some research, but I have not been able to really pin this down to primary sources. I'm going to continue to look, because I'm the kind of nerd who will pin this down to primary sources. But the sources that I have seen attest to this online suggest that the average age of marriage for a young woman in the Regency period was between 23 and 27 years of age, 25 and 29 for men. Teenagers, generally speaking, did not get married during the Regency period, particularly in the middle classes and the lower upper classes. That was really not considered the done thing in England. There are parts of the United Kingdom where that was less true, where we're going through a population explosion in the Highlands of Scotland during the time. So it is generally thought that marriages were happening a little sooner there. But even then, like 20 and 22, not 16, 17, 18 years of age. Large age gaps were and remain largely the product of second marriages rather than initial marriages. And this is worth noting, I think, because we'll circle back to this, I guess, when we introduce Colonel Brandon. But if, hypothetically, there were a relationship to take place between Colonel Brandon and Marianne Dashwood, even if we take the most generous math possible, theirs is the largest age gap in all of Austen's writing. I believe that it comes out to 17 or 18 years, which is more even than Emma. And that makes, Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy's 8-year age gap look like nothing at all. In chapter 7, I'm going to wrap up here with this last slide. We in chapter 7 we party at Barton Park, which is a very pleasing phrase, I'm just now realizing, and I kind of wish that I'd made it the title of this week's episode. We party at Barton Park. We're introduced to Mrs. Jennings, the mother of Lady Middleton, who we're told is a cheerfully vulgar, robust figure at odds with her daughter's coldness, her restraint, her what is the word that we're getting? Her insipidity, right? Could not be more unlike one another, mother and daughter. We're then introduced to Colonel Brandon, who seems grave and sensible and gentlemanly and burdened only with the unthinkable antiquity of a man at least 35 years of age. And then we get to the piano performance. In the evening, as Marianne was discovered to be musical, she was invited to play. The instrument was unlocked, everybody prepared to be charmed, and Marianne, who sang very well at their request, went through the chief of the songs which Lady Middleton had brought into the family on her marriage, and which perhaps had lain ever since in the same position on the pianoforte. for her ladyship had celebrated that event by giving up music, although by her mother's account she had played extremely well, and by her own was very fond of it. Marianne's performance was highly applauded. Sir John was loud in his admiration at the end of every song, and as loud in his conversation as while the others listened. Excuse me. As loud in his conversation with the others while every song lasted. Lady Middleton frequently called him to order, wondering how anyone's attention could be diverted from music for a moment, and asked Marianne to sing a particular song which Marianne had just finished. Colonel Brandon alone, of all the party, heard her without being in raptures. He paid her only the compliment of attention, and she felt a respect for him on the occasion, which the others had reasonably forfeited by their shameless want of taste. His pleasure in music, though it amounted not to that ecstatic delight which alone could sympathize with her own, was estimable when contrasted against the horrible insensibility of the others, and she was reasonable enough to allow that a man of 35 might well have outlived all acuteness of feeling and every exquisite power of enjoyment. She was perfectly disposed to make every allowance for the Colonel's advanced state of life which humanity required. It is sadly impossible to achieve any kind of ecstatic emotional response to art after the age of 35. I mean, really, most of us after the age of 19. I think we all kind of fix our tastes right around there and progress no further. This is one of the sharper, more acute moments of social satire in a story that is already kind of replete with moments of social satire, right? This is a really lovely and pointed criticism of the many different ways in which we might exhibit connection and fellow feeling, right? Obviously, we're playing here on the irony, even if you're reading this for the first time, that Colonel Brandon is paying attention to Marianne's performance. He is giving her all of his focus. We are leveraging all of that gravitas that we talked about in his introduction here, as he is giving her the compliment of attention, as everyone for other reasons is not, as Lady Middleton is chastising her husband for talking through the entire performance. How can anyone not pay attention to the music? Well, clearly she herself, by calling for a song which has just been performed, is also not paying attention to the music. We're going to talk a lot more about exactly how Marianne moderates and mediates between her desire for this ecstatic response to art as we move forward through the book. And we're obviously going to get a lot more opportunities to talk a little about Colonel Brandon. I genuinely wonder, I don't know, I'll need to go and look at the, not even the contemporary responses, but simply the pre-1995 responses. I think that the casting of Alan Rickman as Brandon does a great deal to endear him to modern readers of the book, if you're carrying that image in your head. I think that is going to... Glad Rebecca calls out here in the chat. Though I guess a 16-year-old 35 is pretty old even today. Absolutely. I do not think that Marianne is unjustified in this opinion. As I say, even if we take the most generous appraisal of both of their ages, it's still a pretty big gap, and he's maybe not, giving her everything that she wants from this moment of performance. But again, right, just to call out, I love that she is being considerate of that. She is not in her way insensible to his insensibility. She is not accusing him of being less responsive than he is capable of being, right? We're getting the satire. We're getting the kind of the ridicule that's associated with it, that nobody over the years of 35 can have a big feeling anymore, obviously. But, I think that in her acceptance and the accommodation that she is making for that, we're seeing like a real gentility. I think it's really lovely to get these moments of just gentle-heartedness from Marianne. I think it would have been very easy to make her less likable, less immediate. And if there is a criticism of Sense and Sensibility from a conflict perspective, I suppose, it is simply that maybe both girls are just like a little too good and like a little too sisterly. A modern interpretation, and this is one of the reasons that I'm fearful for this modern interpretation. I think that the Ang mediates this gorgeously. I think that is basically note perfect. I think it is basically a note perfect piece of adaptation, which is one of the reasons that we haven't had another piece of adaptation for 30 years, which is depressingly how long it has been, since 1995. But I do think that there would be an inclination in a modern adaptation, and I genuinely wonder if we're going to avoid this in next year's adaptation or not, to sharpen the edges of both characters, to sharpen the edge of Elinor, probably to move Elinor more into a direct position of absolute protagonism, and to make Marianne more of an antagonistic figure. I think that that's a temptation that a modern screenwriter would have to wrestle with and a modern director would have to process during the shoot. We'll see how it all shakes out. That is going to do it, though, for this week's episode of Stars and Swords, and I kept it, as I promised, to 90 minutes. Well, I said less than 90 minutes, but here we are nonetheless. I hope that you guys will join me for next week as we try to conclude Volume 1 of Sense and Sensibility. In the meantime, please, take a moment, help me continue to make podcasts by heading on over to patreon.com/nextword and pledge $5 a month to support nerdy, deep dive, ad-free podcasts right here on God's own internet. There's a lot out there right now that is not accessible to people. There's a lot of material out there right now that is being burdened by AI, that is being burdened by excessive programmatic advertising, that is just kind of making the media space of the internet that much harder. Part of what I'm trying to do here at Next Word in the company of the brilliant Elizabeth is to create these spaces that are as accessible, inclusive, and unencumbered as possible. And to do that, as creative people and artists have for centuries before us, we rely on patronage from fine folks like you. If you head on over there and you pledge your support, you will get access to dozens and dozens of bonus episodes, including movie discussions on Bridget Jones's Diary. Might be interesting to those of you who like adaptations of Jane Austen's work. We also looked at the 1999 Mummy movie, which is just a barnstormer of a good time under any circumstances, and the Narnia movies, and Master and Commander: The Far Side of the World, one of my personal favorites. That's a great discussion. All of those podcasts are available at patreon.com/nextword. That is going to do it. There's also a very recent episode in which Elizabeth and I discussed Materialists by Celine Song. That came out this Monday. So you can go over there and check that out if you're interested. Patreon.com/nextword. I appreciate your support. That's it for this week. Until next week and the introduction of Willoughby and the end of the first volume. That's going to be a wild ride. Until